What's up, y'all? This is I've Got Questions, Reactions. Kind of first time doing this kind of video, but I wanted to look at this video and react with y'all. So let's do it.
Fast forward to 1492, when Christopher Columbus first caught sight of the New World.
They were seeking fabled, promised lands of plenty where everything would just, run free and there would be this abundant wealth just waiting for them.
As Europeans mastered the oceans, others sailed in Columbus's wake.
For generations, you have people crossing the Atlantic from Europe who are dreaming of America and the life it might give.
The Spanish were the first to establish a permanent settlement in what we now know as Florida. The French soon followed, but the British were in hot pursuit.
The first English men settled in what they saw as the New World in North America in 1607, some who saw themselves as adventurers. They settled the colony of Jamestown in present-day Virginia. Given that they were...
And Jamestown has a lot of racial kind of things aligned with it. We'll probably do something on that in the future.
Men of leisure generally, they didn't have the skills or the knowledge to make a colony survive. In about a decade, 80% had perished. And just at the point when it was looking like Britain's first North American settlement was going to fail, they find that they can grow tobacco. And all of a sudden, that colony begins to boom and grow.
This first British colony opened a gateway to a new life.
The first settlers had this sort of image of themselves as people who were fleeing the old world, and they were building this shining city on a hill that was going to be a beacon to the rest of humanity.
Everybody can live their dream. This is a land full of opportunities.
And that's such a shaping influence on the United States.
The first African slaves came into the Jamestown colony in 1619.
That first ship carried around 20 slaves.
And therein really begins the history of slavery in America.
George Washington was a slave owner. Thomas Jefferson, third president, was a slave owner.
It's hard to, I feel like when we talk about how America isn't racist anymore, or, that stuff is so old. A lot of the people who carved America owned slaves and had, they elicited slavery. So when we think about the country not being racist, when the laws and some of the systems that are set up in this country are really based in racism, and I try to figure out or wonder how people don't think that the country, just because you see black people, as they said, there were probably only 20 slaves. I mean, who knows really what who knows, right? Who really knows? And who knows how many slaves didn't make it? Who knows who was thrown overboard for being mouthy, as they like to say about black people who have an issue with white supremacy. So who really knows how many slaves got here? But like I've said on the show, we are only about 12 to 13% of the current population, as of 2022. And we don't have a stronghold on anything. So when people try to act as if we aren't suffering, that we're fine and all these things, and really the people who hold the country, in the banking, the mortgage system, education, and all that, are mostly white and mostly favor white people. If you talk about like recently Jackson, Mississippi, where they had a issue with water, that was it's a high place of black population, but the surrounding counties and the surrounding cities especially the white ones, they didn't have any issue with water. And this has happened several times with America, where something like that happens. Like you look at Flint, Michigan, and Newark, New Jersey, where they try to, I say, depopulate. And if you drink dirty water, it could definitely kill you. So, like I was saying about, not knowing who was really on that ship, we don't know. And we don't know what really, really happened. We only are told by pretty much white narrative.
From the Constitution is all men are created equal. And it's there that we see the first inherent contradiction.
Women are excluded. The indigenous population is excluded. Enslaved Africans are also excluded.
That refusal to recognize the essential humanity of black people runs right the way through American history.
The America we know today, one of the richest, most powerful democracies in the world, was built on the backs of slaves.
For free. For free. And you really have to think about, and a lot of people don't, a lot of white people don't think about it. A lot of Hispanic and Asian, they don't think about what that is. Imagine if you didn't have to pay your workers. And imagine if you got to keep all the profits from not paying your workers. And then you never ever paid anyone. Jewish people got reparations. We're the only people who didn't get reparations. Native Americans got reparations. We're the only people who did not get reparations.
If you want to become a world power, you can't go too far wrong by integrating a program of almost limitless free labor.
In the 17th and 18th centuries, African slaves mainly worked on the tobacco plantations in the South. But by the early 19th century, this had given way to cotton plantations, as huge demand for cotton grew in America and Europe.
They're trading by the mid-19th century in the millions of bales every year.
And to actually meet that global demand, there is an increased demand for slave labor. It's an economic system as well. It's actually going to, in many ways, drive the destiny of the country.
The property value of slaves increases too.
Those who are seen as healthy and fit are considered prized possessions.
A slave economy is what enables America to really begin to build the extraordinary wealth that it still benefits from today.
By 1860, America's slave population had reached nearly 4 million, resulting in an incredible explosion of the country.
That number is pretty astonishing to me, because if you think about the prison population and what America does with its prison population and how many black people are in prison for frivolous crimes, especially marijuana and non-violent crimes, while the country makes money off of marijuana. Marijuana is a $1 billion industry in this country, while black people sit in prisons and jail cells over marijuana, by the millions. As I've said on the show, if you listen to the show, America's prison population is 25% of the world's prison population, but America only has about 15% of the world's population. Now think about that. You only make up 13 to 15% of the world's population, but out of the entire world of prisons and things of that nature, you make up 25%. That's pretty staggering.
Country's financial power.
The collective wealth held in America's 4 million African American slaves was roughly $3 billion, which was more than the combined value of all the railroads and the factories in the country combined.
Slavery was deeply entrenched in the South. But in the North,
which is why I say, and I've said on the show, if you got rid of us, this country would collapse. So a lot of white people and racist people always tell black people to leave and go back to Africa. But like this guy just said, the slavery business was a $3 billion pretty much corporation. If you didn't have us, you would fall. That's still the same today. Black people do most of the I guess blue collar jobs in this country. We take care of your kids. We are your delivery people. We do all those things. If you didn't have us, this country would collapse.
North, it was a different story.
The North becomes increasingly mechanized. You see the emergence of a factory system. You have an increasingly industrialized North. There's less need for as many physical hands.
The North do see a slave-based economy as part of the past. It's not where America is moving.
By 1860, tensions over slavery had reached a fever pitch. And things escalated further when Abraham Lincoln was elected president.
Lincoln was morally opposed to slavery. The white South fear that he will use his power to bring about the emancipation of the slaves and the destruction of their entire way of life. This is the point of no return.
Convinced that the government would do all in its power to abolish slavery and sever the institution that drove their booming economy, 11 southern states broke away from the North.
Together they form a new country, the Confederate States of America.
Which is I've said a few times. They fly that flag, the Confederate flag, right now. I've seen the Confederate flag being where I live. You fly a flag like that. If you were in any other country, if you were in Nazi Germany and you were kicked out as a Nazi, you were dethroned. If you were flying the Nazi flag, if you were using that symbol, you would be a traitorous person. It would be marked as treason. But because this country allows racism, they're allowed to fly that flag.
Its own currency, its own government.
And they make a new flag, a Confederate flag. For the United States, these individuals are traitors. They have torn the Union apart.
Now you see, they say this here, but that flag still flies. This country has never gotten over racism. This country has never gotten over slavery. This country wants it.
The Civil War had begun. It would embroil America in a deadly battle, bringing into doubt its very survival.
The question of slavery will now be settled in what became the nation's bloodiest war.
There is no doubt that slavery was the fundamental cause of the war, but the abolition of slavery was not Lincoln's priority. That was preservation of the Union.
The nation, in world historical terms, isn't even a toddler yet, right? And so the idea that it could, in fact, be riven by this ideological debate is what Lincoln and many others are desperate to avoid.
Britain and France were ready to recognize the Southern Confederate States as a separate nation. Lincoln had to act.
In January 1863, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation.
This legislation declared that all slaves in active rebellion against the Union shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free.
He's saying, those individuals who are now free, you can come and join the Union and you can fight for us. This proclamation was a wartime measure. It's a war tactic.
Nearly 200,000 African Americans would answer the call to fight against the South.
enslaved African Americans will now fight for their own freedom.
The Civil War was the deadliest conflict in American history. It was brutal. It was horrific.
After 4 years of savage conflict, the Civil War finally ended in 1865.
Remember, they said that slaves, the first slaves, allegedly came to this country in the 1600s.
The Union had been saved, and in a landmark moment, the government passed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery.
The 13th Amendment is the teeth to the Emancipation Proclamation.
The abolition of slavery is monumental.
They were no longer bound by the condition of their mothers to a life of enslavement in perpetuity.
Finally, those famous words that all men are created equal may finally actually be fulfilled.
The 13th Amendment ensured that African Americans would be forever free. But what it didn't answer was this set of thorny questions about what that freedom would actually look like.
We now have 4 million more free individuals in the United States. So what are we going to do? How do we rebuild?
In 1896, America tried to answer that question. But their answer would lead to yet more division, inequality, and bloodshed.
After the Civil War, the United States enters into a period of about 10, 12 years called the period of Reconstruction.
So Reconstruction is a partially successful experiment in securing newfound rights to former slaves. But it comes to an end prematurely because of white Southerners' determination to restore their dominion over the South.
The South lost the war, but the ideology of white supremacy was not dislodged.
And so they fight to make sure that the South remains under the rule of white supremacy.
Okay, we're all equal, but the races do need to remain separate. So the doctrine was known as separate, but equal. They needed that racial hierarchy. They needed that to be written into the law, and they did.
In 1896, a landmark case made racial segregation the law of the land for the whole of the United States.
The Supreme Court say if services are offered equally, it doesn't matter if they're racially segregated. So you actually see a mushrooming of laws across the North and the South that begins to separate and partition the United States. One world for white individuals, another world for black individuals. And it covers...
And they're not showing how some of these places were filthy and disgusting, right? For colored people, as they're saying, colored people. You know, some of the services that, you know, were being given didn't have to be structurally sound at all. You know, it was just another place where black people should go because they weren't allowed in certain other places.
Everything that you can think of, interracial marriage is banned. You cannot work together. You cannot eat together.
We would have a black school and a white school, and we'd have one carriage in a railway car and 9 where white people could sit. What I'm getting at here is that it was never equal. And
which was what I was just talking about. And you also see policing was never separate at all. Right? So you never had black cops, really, right? Or ever back then. You never had black cops. It was always white cops still policing black communities.
And so racial inequality finds new life.
Segregation to the average Negro means being held back. He wants to move forward in the American mainstream. Segregation holds him back.
And for the white people who say, well, why don't you just do your own thing? Well, how can you do that in a country where you're being held down? How can you seriously do that? You can't, right? Because if we like music, right? If we want to get on the radio or something, it's owned by white people. How do you, there's so much owned by white America. How do you break in? How do you have your own when you're not given the same exact amount of land, the same exact amount of power? You have to create your own power company. But how do you do that when you built the power company for free? And now you don't have the money to build your own. But they want you to. They say build your own, get your own. But y'all, we built it for free for y'all, but then you just expect it for us to just build it. You had free labor.
America was now brutally divided along racial lines.
Racial segregation was humiliating and degrading. You were not one of those individuals who lived in the land of the free.
All of this would have an enormous psychological effect on the African American population, partly because if you fell foul of particular laws, the consequences would be dire.
Intimidation and violence were used to prevent African Americans going about their everyday lives, and even from exercising their constitutional right to vote.
You could be beaten. Your house could be burned down. You could be lynched.
These are sadistic forms of violence. It's not just the physical oppression, it's the psychological oppression. That the threat of the violence was this long shadow cast over African Americans that conditioned their every move in public.
The most ruthless and notorious organization that rose up during this period was the Ku Klux Klan, who unleashed...
There was that flag again that y'all say is not racial.
A reign of terror on the black communities.
The Ku Klux Klan is a terrorist organization.
The mission of the Klan was the preservation of white people at the top of a racial hierarchy.
I told the mayor here if he refused to negotiate the racial issue with the members of the Klan, that we would start an economic boycott against this city.
The Klan actually reaches its greatest power in the 1920s when it has several million followers. It's so powerful that its members are able to march publicly on the streets of Washington, D.C. in front of the nation's capital.
In the capital.
With white supremacist organizations like the KKK and racial segregation enforced throughout the country, equality seemed impossible.
World War II is yet another turning point in this story of African American freedom.
During the war, 125,000 African American soldiers were sent abroad to fight, and what they encountered while serving sparked a revolution.
The experience of being stationed overseas is a moment of enlightenment for many African American soldiers. Be they stationed in Britain or France or Italy, they experienced greater interaction between the races. They fought a war to liberate Europe, and yet they were returning home to a country that didn't bestow the same kind of rights and privileges to people of color. Many veterans, when they return home, seek to push for racial change and reform.
Could you imagine fighting for a country, right? They send you out there, you could lose your limbs, you could lose your eye, you could lose your fingers, and then coming back home and still being treated like a slave or a nigger. Can you really imagine that? Do you know how many veterans in this country there are that are black that still get treated that way?
They initiate the Double V campaign. We will fight fascism abroad, and we will also fight racism at home. Really the precursor to what we'll see in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s.
An event on the 5th of December, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, would become the critical moment in this burgeoning movement.
Rosa Parks decided on that day in December that she would not give up her seat on the bus as was required by racial segregation laws.
She was arrested and taken to jail. And the outcry in the black community that such a well-known and dignified woman had been jailed sparked the Montgomery bus boycott.
And what do I always talk about on this channel? That if black people did not decide to be a part of certain systems, it would make the systems collapse. By boycotting an entire bus system, they wouldn't have money. Those people getting their pockets fatter and fatter, they lost their minds. That's why things started changing. And I continue to say, if there was a great black walkout, this country would collapse. It's something that should be talked about. It's something that should be threatened, because of the simple fact of the matter is, we shouldn't be treated the way that we currently still are. Yes, we may be able to ride the bus with you. Yes, we may be able to be in the same restaurant as you. But there still are systematic instances of racism that plague this country as of today in 2022.
Over a year, African Americans refused to use the buses in Montgomery. And
this was the real camaraderie of black people right here. This is when we all got together and we said no. Now you don't have that. Now you have black people who won't even say Black Lives Matter because they don't want to be in that stuff. They don't want to talk about race. They don't want to talk about politics. Because of, I feel, how hard it's been on us. And that they don't want to have to think about that. It's, again, Stockholm Syndrome.
They actually bankrupt the company, forcing them to come to the table to negotiate and to finally end practices of racial segregation on the buses.
Rosa Parks became known as the mother of the civil rights movement, and the Montgomery bus boycott would also place young pastor Martin Luther King at the front and center.
Martin Luther King is the icon of the civil rights movement.
He had a way to connect with the nation, to tell the nation that you are not living up to what you defined yourselves to be.
We will no longer sell our birthright of freedom for the mess of segregated pottage.
The reason that he's so iconic is because of his philosophy of nonviolence. It's an extraordinary radical move to say, we're going to fight this injustice without violence. So that contrast becomes very, very powerful.
Unlike the Civil War just a century earlier, peaceful protest would form the bedrock of the entire movement, which exploded in 1960.
Students bring a vigor and an intensity that hasn't quite been witnessed before.
The student sit-ins are simply an attempt to secure integrated seating at lunch counters across the South.
They begin to occupy spaces where they are told you are not allowed to be. And they say, we're here and we're going to stay.
People would pour drinks over their heads. They were being told to sit quietly, to not retaliate, to do nothing.
They are engaging in acts of non-violent civil disobedience. These students are actually breaking the law.
On February 27, 80 Nashville students were arrested out of over 300.
This is a new radical phase of protest that willing to peacefully defy laws that they can withstand the worst that the white power structure can throw at them. It's that sharper-edged protest that will bring about the civil rights revolution of the 1960s.
By the late summer of 1963, more than 200,000 people marched on Washington.
Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please.
They gathered by the Lincoln Memorial, the very place where just 4 decades ago, the KKK had been allowed to protest. Their aim? To push through civil rights legislation and establish job equality for all.
I am am happy to join with you today in what will go down as the greatest demonstration.
And not taking away from any other people, I really am not. But black people are some beautiful people. Look at these black people. Woo! Beautiful men and women and children. Beautiful. That's what the supremacists hate. They hate the togetherness and they hate the melanin, even though it's the same melanin that they come from. We all come from the same place. We all come from Africa.
For freedom in the history of our nation.
It's at that protest in Washington that King, standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, delivers his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream oration.
But that speech is far more than a dream. It's actually a critique of the United States. He's actually addressing the nation on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Are African Americans free 100 years later after Abraham Lincoln first said, yes, you are free? Martin Luther King says no. The nation has not lived up to that promise. Martin Luther King really understood the potential of the United States, and he pushed the United States to live up to what the founding fathers saw for the nation.
The following year, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law, ending nearly a century of racial segregation. And the Voting Act, guaranteeing African Americans the right to exercise their vote, was passed 12 months later. It had taken over 3 centuries since the arrival of the first slaves in Jamestown to finally address the deep-seated problems that had blighted America.
We still talk about these things because they still happen. It's such a sad thing that even 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation that he had to make that speech, Martin Luther King. You think about 50 to 60 years later, and we still are facing policing issues. We're still facing maybe not segregation, but segregation of who gets what kind of loan. What business gets what? What community gets a certain type of water? Who gets the best housing? Who gets the most responses from the fire department? We have literal hospital closings in Georgia even, where they close hospitals in black communities, but not white communities. If you don't want the race card to be played, stop playing the game yourself. I ask of white people, I ask of all people to really realize who puts us against each other and why they do it. If you don't ban racism as a whole, if you don't ban the Confederate flag as a whole, you allow it to breathe. You allow it to manifest more and more. And as we continue to see these patriot people, these people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, we continue to see that supremacy is alive and well.